everybody. Here is your first episode of my new series that I'm doing. It's called Bedtime Tales, or Mango's Bedtime Tales, or Bedtime Stories with Mango. Something. I don't know yet. Haven't decided. Anyways, let's just read a story, yeah. Alright. So, first one in this series is going to be called The Archfiend's Fingers, and it is written by Kirk Mashburn. What place this was into which he had stumbled, John Power neither knew nor cared. It was some shady cabaret, some dimly lit dive of sinister shadows, perhaps near to the waterfront. Slumped at a small table, he sensed little of what went on around him, remembering nothing of how he became separated from his friends. It was carnival time, Mardi Gras Day in New Orleans. Vaguely, Power knew that he had celebrated too enthusiastically, had drunk too freely. There was a blank in his memory, and everything was rather more than hazy. He had no knowledge, even, that the thinning backwash of the carnival crowds no longer eddied in the street outside, and warily dissolved into the early night. Something of his surroundings obscurely troubled the bemused man, but it was too weighty and painful an effort to think. His head throbbed dully, nausea reached slyly, touched him with a tentative finger. It seemed that someone spoke from across the table. "Your pardon, sir. I have no wish to intrude, but you appear in need of something to lower your stomach and raise your spirits." In blurred, indistinct outline, Power saw that there was indeed another person seated opposite him. The stranger laughed dryly, as though his indulgence might be tinged with faintly contemptuous amusement. He beckoned, spoke succulently to a none too clean waiter, who answered the gesture. A drink was brought, a palely green drink that shimmered in its glass, as if with flecks of gold in its depths. The stranger pressed the greenish drink upon the younger man with obdurate, if kindly guised insistence. Power groaned weakly, swallowed the virescent potion and nausea together, knowing he was shortly to be ill, hoping with feeble malice that he would be very unpleasantly ill. Then, perhaps, they would let him alone. The draught stung his palate, seared his throat, struck his stomach like flowing fire. Amazingly, almost before he could gasp for breath, nausea vanished. The throbbing at his temples began to still, the fog to lift from his wits. "Ah, that is better, is it not?" The stranger nodded, smiled easily. Power looked across at him with mixed emotions, in which some trace of resentment lingered. He took in the dark, saturnine countenance, about which there was something familiar, vaguely and disturbingly familiar. Somewhere, he thought, he had seen that high forehead. The whisper of memory strove to identify that arrogant, narrow-bridged nose, the oddly arched brows, and the thin-lipped mouth that presently wore a smile of tolerant amusement. Only the eyes were unfamiliar, John Power felt that he had seen the face without having looked into the dark, glittering eyes. His memory could not otherwise have escaped some record of their chill fascination. It was as if he remembered a picture of the face, rather than the living countenance. "I feel better," Power belatedly acknowledged. "That is, I don't feel ill, nor stupid, as I did. But," he brushed a hand uncertainly across his eyes, "I don't know." The stranger, he made no move to identify himself, nor, strangely, did the thought occur to Power. The stranger laughed again. His was an enfolding laugh, a laugh of comprehension. It was as if he knew and understood all the insidious perplexities of mankind, and was glad of mankind's human frailty. The waiter brought more of the green drinks. The stranger talked to Power while they were coming, and the latter listened. They drank often, always the green drinks. But Power had never felt more alive. His mind had never before seemed quite so active. Occasionally the stranger passed him cigarettes, apparently of tobacco in which the blending gave a peculiar distinctive taste that was not, however, displeasing at the moment. At length, the bracing effort Power had experienced with the first draught of the green liquor began to wear off. His head was resuming its throbbing, and thinking was again an effort. A feeling of uneasiness assailed him with recurring insistence. He sensed that something disturbing in his surroundings, something that included his unknown yet oddly familiar table companion. He decided to go while the effort was still possible, wondered that he had not taken his leave after that revitalizing first drink. With difficulty he gained his feet, hastened by a sudden rising impulse of dread. Instinctive, insinuating dread that came unsummoned and unexplained. "Surely you will not leave so early?" It was the stranger who spoke, but the simple question seemed, to Power's tortured fancy, fraught with irony and all the weight of a command. Giddily he sought to focus his thoughts. Thickly he repeated the intention of departing, thinking that, despite himself, he spoke so low that his words were almost whispered. Then he wondered whether, instead, he had shouted. Everyone in the place appeared to have centered attention suddenly in his direction. As Power peered about him, each face among those present flared into startling distinctness. And what faces they were! There were nightmare visages of horror, grotesque, distorted faces that worked with slaving malice as they approached. God, what place was this into which he had blundered? There were other faces, pale with pallor of death, set masks of woe and utter, horrible despair. One fantastic shape detached itself and came forward, apart from its fellows. It wore a Spanish helmet and a breastplate of antique design, and was shod in high Spanish boots. The shadowing helmet blurred the face beneath. and that but intensified an impression of hideous fearsomeness. As the monster came beneath the ceiling light. Or was there a light? Was there even a ceiling? Power observed that in its armor, its garments, even to the high boots, looked to be splotched and smeared with red. Bloody splotches that spread and merged until they wholly enveloped the sinister figure. "Who are you?" Power snarled in uneasy anger. There was no answer. It was an easy and natural transition in Power's irrational condition, from disturbed peevishness to sudden flaring rage. Still snarling, he staggered up, seized his chair, and raised it to hurl at the motionless figure in the ancient Spanish armor. But his table companion, who had sat motionless until that moment, sprang forward with outstretched hands. Suddenly it seemed to Power that he saw the stranger with blinding clearness, as if a veil had been torn aside. Saw him and knew him for what he was. At the sight of those reaching talons, fear snapped in the last shreds of his control. He screamed aloud in his panic, "Help!" And again, "Help!" From a door in the rear of the place leaped a figure, and Power shouted with joy upon recognizing the waiter who had served his table. But no. Before his eyes, an awful metamorphosis occurred. The attendant was but another demon come to join the grim, silently encircling throng. "Away, fiends!" Power shrieked, again raising the chair he held. Before he could fling it, the stranger had seized his wrist. To Power, it felt as if those taloned fingers seared through his flesh to the bone. "Back! All of you stand back!" he cried, clutching his hand. He cried of the clutching hands, "Let me deal with him alone." The words seared Power's brain. He was claimed by the Archfiend himself. The thought gave final impetus to his madness. Wrenching violently from the grasp that pained his wrist and swinging the chair before him, Power swept a path of havoc to the door. The door opened. Power gained the street with a bound, fled over ancient flagstones down dim, narrow, cobbled streets. What course he covered in his twisted flight he never knew afterward. At the moment, he cared only that it was away from the clamorous pursuit upon his heels. At length, looking up, the fugitive recognized an enclosure within a high iron fence, a fence in which gaped an open gate. Clanging shut and latching the gate in the faces of the foremost of the racing figures at his back, Power bounded across Jackson Square, where the hero of Camelot sat his charger in bronze disdain of the turmoil broiling in his shadow. The gate stopped pursuit for a few precious moments. Power made for the opposite side of the square, where St. Louis Cathedral loomed out of the shadows, across a narrow street. He was spent. A myriad aches racked his heaving chest. But he knew that he must cross the street, gain the cathedral. They could never enter there. He staggered into the open vestibule as the chimes pealed on the stroke of midnight. The period of carnival was over. Ash Wednesday and Lenten penitents were ushered in. While Power beat against the inner doors, The patter of pursuing feet sounded without, as their spent quarry sagged and crumpled to the floor. "Sanctuary," he sobbed. "Sanctuary!" A sound of rushing waters filled his eardrums, almost to bursting. Darkness crowded in, encompassed him. The gasping figure in the cathedral vestibule sank into merciful oblivion. Power recovered his senses in what seemed like a few seconds. Tripping hammers pounded inside his head, and he was conscious of acute and consuming thirst. Still dominating every other thought was the urge to crawl further into the cathedral. It had been so much darker a moment ago, he thought with vague wonder, as he strove to drag himself forward. Something interfered with his effort. He peered dazedly at what it was. Then Power sat up with a jerk that nearly burst his head, filling him with giddiness. He groaned aloud. He was in a small white bed, in a white-walled room with other small white beds. A hospital ward! At his movement, a white-uniformed nurse came briskly forward. "What happened?" Power croaked, ignoring the nurse's injunction to lie down and be quiet. "How long have I been here?" "Since last night, when you were found collapsed at the doors of St. Louis Cathedral," the nurse replied. Her voice was brittle with disapproval. "Why was I brought here?" Power demanded, groping insistently. "Because you were suffering from the effects of acute alcoholism," tartly returned the nurse. And also, her tone was defiantly accusing. "You are raving as the result of smoking marijuana." "Marijuana?" Power stupidly repeated. "Sea salt, hashish," crisply affirmed the nurse, turning away. "Will you please lie down?" But Power had become aware of a dull pain that was apart from the bursting of his head. Lifting a hand, he stared at the bandage swathing his wrist. He would never be able to forget the stranger who had shared his table, uninvited, in a shadowed, unknown place. Hazily, he remembered smoking cigarettes of a peculiar, acrid taste. But premonition whispered that drink nor drug would ever explain the reason for the gauze wrapped about his wrist. Slowly, Power removed the bandage, except that they were burnt like a brand into his flesh. The marks upon his wrist were the livid imprint of a thumb and 4 long, pointed fingers. Good night, everybody. Have sweet nightmares.